Welcome. We're going to look at, in this video, we're going to look at guides to methods of critical thinking. As in, if you're one of those people who really still finds that they can't think critically and they just don't know where to start, then you must really look at thinking differently. And what we're going to look at today is we're going to look at a couple of different ideas and philosophies and ways of thinking that might really get you on the right track. We're also going to look at a number of models. So they're not really important that you actually remember them, but you just need to look at the strategies involved and actually think, okay, maybe I need to think this way or that way. Okay, it's something where and seeing as English is mostly about critical thinking and how you apply those skills, especially when it comes to writing and being able to respond to things, then you need to be able to look at more than just really what is there in the text, but actually think about it in a critical way. And ultimately, this is what these strategies are for. As I said, you don't need to memorize names, you don't need to write them down, you don't need to try and adopt these and go, oh yeah, I need to do these sort of different methods. All you need to do is just really think about and look at these and think of different ways of doing things. Okay, we're going to start by looking at reasoning. Now, what reasoning is a couple of processes for starting big, working small, or the opposite way around. And it means being able to prove things with evidence. So like you do when you're actually trying to find a quote in a book, or a film, or whatever it may be, then you'll start by looking at it in two ways. For instance, start with the deductive method, where you start by reading the whole thing or watching the whole thing, and then you work your way down to a small part. So for instance, if the whole book was like a forest, then you'd be looking for the seeds, the seedlings, all those things, the small little bits that make it up, and ultimately how it goes together. Of course, you can also start with the other method, where you start with the small things. Start directly with the small details and work your way back up to the whole text. Now, there are some pros and cons about both of these methods. And what we're going to look at now is we're going to look at what they are. So, there is a bit more, and we're going to look at this with an English-based example. So, to start with, deductive, as in, I've read this book and it's about ponies. I found a chapter about ponies which represent what I think the book is about. Therefore, I can safely describe that the book is about ponies. It's a perfectly valid argument. There's nothing wrong with that. The only danger is if the book is about horses and I keep calling them ponies. Or the book is about nothing to do with ponies, and that if I'm trying to prove that it has something to do with ponies and it has absolutely nothing to do with ponies to begin with, then it's not going to be correct, obviously. However, and you should be able to, it's a fairly simple method, and if you've read the whole thing, then chances are you'll probably know what it's about. If you've only read the title of the book and then pick out a quote, chances are then you're not going to really have this deductive reasoning down. So it's really just a process of reading the book and then finding a small detail that matches the idea that I have about the book. Okay, and that's ultimately what you're trying to do, and that's ultimately what your quotes and evidence are for, is to use a small part to prove the whole thing, rather than talk about the small part and small part and small part, because you're only going to cover a very, very tiny fraction of the book if you do that. Inductive is the opposite. So I read a chapter about ponies in a book. Therefore, seeing as it wasn't a book, the whole book is about ponies. So if I read a book and I only read the first chapter and the first chapter was about ponies, great, book's about ponies. But what the rest of the chapters aren't. And that is what makes this idea a little bit sketchy. It makes the deductive method a lot more effective, because if you don't bother to read the whole thing, or if you don't bother to use those to actually prove the whole, then what happens is that you will try and prove something which may not necessarily be true of the whole thing. So just because one book or one chapter in the book has a pony doesn't mean they all do. Now, you might think, well, how's this relevant? Well, often when you pull out a lot of quotes, then you're really talking about ideas that really represent one section of the text. And quite often, not many actually link it to the whole text. It just seems to be quote after quote after quote, which proves perhaps an idea. But you need to say how it's represented through a whole text, and how it's sustained, or if there's any change, and how that occurs, depending on if it's a constant in the story, as in it remains the same, or if it's a different, something that changes throughout. So what you need to do is you need to find some things which prove what your point of view is. If a character changes halfway through, then you need to find, obviously, or think about what that change is, and then start to look for where those changes are. So you need to find, if for instance about pony becoming a horse, then you need to find one bit about it being a pony and another bit about being a horse. So if you're just doing it in the inductive method and you don't really bother looking at the whole thing, then you're not really going to get the same level of detail. And ultimately, yes, you may get lucky and the whole book may be about ponies, but if you don't really look into it, you're not going to get the same level of insight you will with this. However, both methods still have their purpose. Okay, how do I use this? Well, to start with, you should work backwards from the whole text to specifics to find answers. So you need to look at the whole thing first. Obviously, you need to watch it. That's the first thing you need to do. Then you need to have some ideas in mind about what the thing is actually about. And then you work backwards to work out, okay, how does it represent that through its various features and various ideas? And once you discuss all those things, you've got a complete answer. If you just discuss the small features and don't really relate them back to how you got to your ideas and how you got back to your whole, then you're not going to get a very cohesive response. It's one of the things you actually have to do is, and this is why I said both methods are still effective and they're still both used, is because you go back and forth. So you go backwards using the deductive method and then forward using the inductive method. Of course, if you feel confident about from the beginning, there's no need to really go back again. But if you want to just make sure it all relates to your initial ideas, then you would use that evidence and see if it proves what you earlier said. And that's ultimately what the deductive method is doing anyway. The inductive process is a good way to test quotes against the whole text. So actually starting with it and then going, okay, once I know what the whole text is about, does it match? Does it make sense? All right, can I apply it to that? That is, find a part of the text that proves the whole. And that's ultimately, again, what you're trying to do. You need to also be able to add more links in order to gain a stronger insight and then further your analysis as well. So what you're doing is you're trying to find the right kinds of links, the ones that represent really significant moments. And the best way to do that is to start with the deductive method, work backwards, and then if you need to prove it, if you really are not sure, make sure that you can then link it back to your main point or what the text is about. All right. Now, next thing we're going to look at is logos, ethos, and pathos. And they are developed by a man called Aristotle who lived a long time ago. And it relates to how an audience can be affected by a particular argument or a particular point of view. And if you're looking at a question to do with audience engagement, then these are the three different methods that you need to refer to. Number one, logos. And that it appeals to logic and reason, uses facts and evidence. So if a text is trying to appeal to its audience or relates to its audience using facts and evidence, then that is what it is doing, is using that strategy. If it's trying to appeal to morality of ethics, it's trying to appeal to someone's feeling of right and wrong. So number one, we've got the feeling of right and wrong, the feeling of logic and reason, and the second one, we've got right and wrong. The third one, it's an emotional response, and it's one that tries to develop emotional reactions in order to make an audience care, and that's what pathos is. So those are the three ways in which a text ultimately communicates with its audience, whether it be an emotional, whether it talk about things in a moral, like a fable, for instance, and in terms of using logic and reasoning, as in that's the most natural solution. Ultimately, most creative texts will use pathos, because most of them are emotional, they take you on the thrill ride. Fables and stories with a point will maybe go towards the ethics and moral side. If it's something which is just trying to convince you of something using evidence, i.e. an essay, then it will use the logical argument. Okay, so how do you use this? Well, the connection to audience and meaning is a key component of writing or writing about a text. So if you're writing a text, then you need to try and connect with your audience somehow, and you'll be using those three methods in order to do that. If you're writing about a text, then you need to judge how a text, or actually talk about how a text is actually doing that. Now, if you're thinking about it in a logical way, in an emotional way, or a moral way, then all of those things is what incorporates what a text may be trying to do. Of course, they may overlap, and it may be doing a couple of things, but it may be doing all three of them even. But it's one of those ways it can really look at actually developing and really understanding an insight into how those that text communicates and ultimately who it's speaking to and how it's speaking to them. They sum up the ways in which one can communicate, and through languages writing, writing and film, speech and performance. Okay, so through those different languages, through the use of different techniques, they're ultimately the purpose of them and the way that they communicate with their audience, particularly if you get a question where you're asked to discuss its relationship based on what you think or what it relates or how it relates to an audience, then you'd be looking at these methods and seeing, okay, it's appealing to an audience's morality, it's appealing to an audience's emotion, how? So for instance, if you're saying what the to be or not to be soliloquy is referring to in Hamlet, then it's an emotional message and it's also a moral message. Okay, it's both of those. It's a moral message because it sort of appeals to people's moral judgments on suicide. It's an emotional one because it sort of gives us an insight into his mind and makes us really think about the person that he is and think about whether or not we would do the same thing if we were in his position. It asks and invites us to know and to be able to ask those sorts of questions in order to really connect with that character. And ultimately, that is a text communicating and engaging an audience. And it may be one thing that you're asked to write about. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is a set of hats. And it's by a professor called Edward de Bono. He's still alive. And he proposed 6 different ways of thinking. He is a philosopher / psychologist / he does about 1,000 things. He's responsible for a lot of different ways of thinking. He's known as one of the world's best thinkers. And he devised basically not only the term lateral thinking, but he devised 6 hats in order to describe how a person may think. So the first one is informational. As in, they use really facts and hard evidence in order to be able to think. The next is process. They look at it from an overview sort of perspective. As in, they look at the entire process which goes into creating an idea. And you'd be using this if you're thinking about your study plans. Judgmental. As in making a judgment. This one's a very critical one. This is one that makes an immediate judgment and one that ultimately is a critic, so to speak. Feelings. Using an emotional side. And certainly if we're looking at that Ethos, Logos and Pathos again, all of these are covered here. So how things are measured in feelings. In terms of creativity, in terms of new ways of doing things, different solutions. And finally, optimism. Ways that you can be optimistic about something and think about things in a positive way. Okay, so we've got here 6 different ones and they correspond to different colours. So the colours that you'll see here are basically words or associations that sort of should get you to really look at it. So for instance, the hat of blue for the process is the blue sky method, as in you look up at the sky and you look at the whole picture. Ultimately, all these things together represent the kinds of ways that you can think about something. So let's go into a little bit more detail now. So you need to be able to start to think your own way and of course ask lots of different questions. For instance, if I was asking a question using the white hat, what kind of information do I have? What can I find? That's going to prove my idea. If you've got blue, what process can I use to manipulate this information that I've got? Black, what's wrong with it? Okay, is there anything wrong with it? Does it make sense? Make a critical judgment and actually criticize what it is you're doing. And this is something you do in reflection as well as when you're writing it. How do I feel about it? Actually, do I feel confident about it? Does it actually really represent the best way of doing it? Use your gut instinct. It's a very good thing. Even when you're analyzing a text, how does it make me feel is one of the most important questions you can ask yourself because it will get you towards these sorts of judgmental and informational questions. What information suggests this? What makes me think this? As in, you can change a couple of words around each question. That's fine. And what process can I use? Can I discuss it using technique, structure? What process informs this? What other ideas are there? So is there a better way this can be represented? And finally, what are the good points? As in being positive and being actually confident that what you have is the right answer. Or if you're not confident, finding the points which you do find are good, and then using these other processes again to be able to find new and more information. So this covers all the processes that you would use when you're writing a response, interpreting and analyzing a text, and ultimately developing a strategy for being able to answer a text. So in conclusion, critical thinking is an essential process and something that you need to be able to do. And using these methods is a way where you can really start to think about thinking in a different way. All right. Ask yourself those questions, because ultimately those questions are what you need to ask of everything that you do. You need to be able to ask those critical questions, as I said, and finally you need to think about how texts convey facts, emotions, and perspectives. And that's really what these different strategies represent: facts, emotions, and perspectives, or essentially how you would look at things through an Ethos, Logos, and Pathos interpretation. But otherwise, that's it for critical thinking and the skills of critical thinking. So until next time, I'll see you later.